We've been really looking forward to this reading, and we are delighted to have David with us. He's the author or editor of 8 books. His most recent collection of poems are Charming Gardeners and the Book of Men and Women, which received the Oregon Book Award in 2009, as well as the Everyman's Library anthology, Poems of the American South. His books of prose include Every Writer Has 1,000 Faces and A Long High Whistle, selected columns due out in March. He founded the Attic Institute of Arts and Letters in 1999 as an independent writing studio in Portland's Hawthorne District. The Willamette Week calls it the best place to study creative writing in Portland. He writes a Poetry Wire column for the Rumpus. He's a Stegner Fellow. I will tell you that I'm reading his book, Every Writer Has 1,000 Faces, and if you're interested in writing, I can really recommend it. I'm learning things about David. I didn't know he was a Stegner Fellow, so he may tell us when he was there. I didn't know that he was a competitive diver. So David used to be a competitive diver at a very high level. So he may be telling us something about that. He's had a Lannan Fellowship and a National Endowment of the Arts Fellowship in Literature. A very erudite and accomplished person. Would you join me in welcoming our poet for tonight, David Biespiel? David.
Well, Tom, thanks for inviting me back here. I came and gave a reading here, I think in 2009, maybe 10. And when I left, I said to the person I was with, that is the best place I've ever given a reading ever, and the best audience I'd ever read to in a long time. And I'm really glad to be back here. And that's all really the work of the library and Tom. And thank you very much for all the work you do to promote poetry here in Milwaukie and beyond. It's like we're in a coffee shop. I'd like a cappuccino. Yeah. Oh, and I want to do something else. Tom said he came to my reading I gave a couple months back at Powell's. It may have been last spring. And he wanted to get a copy of this book, but they sold them out. And I was going to read from this book, but I decided to do something else. So instead, I'm just going to give it to Tom. It's the way Robert Bly does it is he throws them out. Doesn't he? Just throwing books out. That's after he tells you to shoot your children because they watch too much television. He says, put them out of their pain now. He's funny. Okay, there's a little bit to do here. I'm going to begin reading to you a little bit of prose and unfortunately maybe a little bit of analysis of something. You can hear okay? I just don't feel like you can hear all right. Should I get closer? Is that good? That's better. I'm working on a book of prose based on some essays I've written. And the book right now I'm calling it A Ladder to the Underground. And it's about the sources of poetry and how one maneuvers between living in the modern world, your everyday life, really. The modern world is always the modern world. Your everyday life, and those of you who write or do another art, exiting the modern world into the realm of your imagination, what trials you might face there, and then returning from the realm of your imagination back to the everyday world. This could take place in a matter of minutes, hours, periodically over and over throughout time, and bringing back with you, in my case, the poem or the painting or something like that, and what the world is like when you come back to it and what you're like. And so I just wanted to read you something a little bit about these passageways, and by way of introducing to you what I'm going to read in a second. I haven't had any coffee all day until about 10 minutes ago. That's why I'm smiling. And I'm sorry. I need all devices on deck here to do this. Let's see. Okay, poems are vessels of new meaning and new life. James writes a daring poem called A Blessing, ritualizes the reenactment as the initiation from birth to rebirth. A poem as an initiation of birth to rebirth. The poem opens with an incident during the passage of twilight. Just off the highway to Rochester, Minnesota, twilight bounds softly forth on the grass. Just off the highway to Rochester, Minnesota, twilight bounds softly forth on the grass. As an essential daily moment, dividing day from night in the living world, dusk is a sacred space. It's shared by every human being, perhaps every single being since the beginning of time. It is easy for us to see dusk as an emotionally endowed passage. Dusk is not just representative of the difference between day and night. It's a sensory territory between ignorance and awareness, carelessness and alertness, semi-attention and deep consciousness. When James Wright enters this shared passage of time and mindfulness in the twilight, he encounters there an alien and beastly other. Then, after he crosses the barbed wire fence, he steps over the barbed wire fence, I'll read that in a sec, the barbed wire fence from modernity into the imaginary, he seeks to unite with what brings the human to mind. And here's the poem. I'm sure some of you know this. A Blessing. Just off the highway to Rochester, Minnesota, twilight bounds softly forth on the grass. And the eyes of those two Indian ponies darken with kindness. They have come gladly out of the willows to welcome my friend and me. We step over the barbed wire into the pasture where they have been grazing all day alone. They ripple tensely. They can hardly contain their happiness that we have come. They bow shyly as wet swans. They love each other. There is no loneliness like theirs. At home once more, they begin munching the young tufts of spring in the darkness. I would like to hold the slenderer one in my arms, for she has walked over to me and nuzzled my left hand. She is black and white. Her mane falls wild on her forehead, and the light breeze moves me to caress her long ear that is delicate as the skin over a girl's wrist. Suddenly I realize that if I stepped out of my body, I would break into blossom. After the incident has been initiated of coming off the highway and crossing the fence into the field, and the passage has been completed, both the narrator and I think us as readers and listeners are ready for a transformative rebirth. Suddenly I realize that if I stepped out of my body, I would break into blossom. Existing in a semi-attentive living state of mind prior to the start of the poem, and then coming off the highway of modernity, the poet, in A Blessing, encounters what all poets encounter. You encounter new possibilities of living previously unknown. You discover the essential importance of your inner cognizance as it relates to the world, and you return from the poetic experience with a reborn identity. A Blessing dramatizes what you experience every time you write, and I want to say also read a poem. It dramatizes the ascendancy of a new outlook on life and the grace of transformation that comes with it. Well, I've been thinking a lot about that, about what it's like to enter a poem and exist in it, and how long can you stay in the poem and then return. And then when you return, I'm finding this, the troubling thing is the world was going on while you were gone. And it's changing. And hopefully you're changing too. You know, you're being changed by what it is you're working on. And these two changed entities don't always match up. For the last year, have been working on a long poem. It's at this stage about 100 some pages. It's in 44 sections. I'm only going to read 42 of them to you tonight. No. You said 3 hours to read, right? Just 3 hours, right? 2.5. No, I've been working on this long poem, and I want to just tell you a little bit about it. And I'm going to read a few parts to you. They're a little longer. It's a casually spoken sort of poem, and it has all the trappings of a poem, but I won't say anything about that. Well, it's just a difficult time we live in. It really is. And we just experienced another round of difficulty in the last few days, last few minutes. Just doesn't seem to stop. And I've been thinking a lot about, the initiation of this period. I think of it as the sort of post 9/11 wars period. And, when on September 11th, I was here in the West, as I suppose many of you were, and I just began thinking around that time what it was like to experience something so violent and yet be so distant from it. And I came to be thinking that, well, that's true of so many things. History, natural disasters, when you're safe and you're witnessing them, I use that loosely, witnessing them on television. And the one thing about your memory is it changes, it distorts and degrades and it fantasizes. But when you see your memory on television, it never changes. Just to be blunt about it, there's the plane, there's the tower, there's the accident, followed by the plane, the tower. You always see it in the same order, exactly the same way. Where with my memory, even, I walked in and said hello to Andrea. I have to start remaking that in my mind right now. It happened 5 minutes ago. But if we did it on television, I could see it immediately. She stood up, I turned, she stood to me. Happens the same way. Well, that's not what life is like. So I began trying to think about why that is, and I think it's because as much as we value memory, and I think memory is essential. I mean, I don't have to tell you why. Memory is essential, especially for a writer. So is forgetting. And so I wanted to start writing about forgetting and the necessity of forgetting as a way to carry on. So I'm going to read some parts of this. I'm going to read the first part. I'll tell you about that in a second. And then just kind of randomly, I just thought, well, I'll read every 8 or 9 sections. I'll just read part 1, and I'll go to part 9. And I didn't know what to read, so I just thought I'd make a mathematical formula and stick with it. The manuscript, I worked on it in the spring, worked on it over the summer, I took a break, and then September I went down to Texas. I'm from Texas. I went down to Texas for a month and really finished it, I think. And it's been sitting on my desk almost untouched since October until a couple of weeks back. And then I just began, I wanted to age a little bit and rest, and I needed a rest. And I started working on it a little bit again. I'm starting to understand what it is. And what it is there's a couple. It's not a novel so much like that, but there's a real life experience. I was in a relationship. It takes place, kind of a composite of things, takes place kind of on September 11th in the West, in a room. And in the very room that broadside, which I wrote several years ago, that was really the initiator for the poem, for the whole book. And then it begins to sort of track back and forth between events, and you'll see. You'll see. And then I think I'll stop at that point, and I'll maybe field a few questions if you like, and then I'll finish by reading the broadside. You okay? You can hear? You comfortable? You got enough coffee? I need some more. I also want to say I have a handful of students here too, and I'm so grateful that they came. I can't believe they showed up. It's going to completely ruin my teaching to have them here hearing my own poems. But I thought fair is fair, and I would read new work. So. We are walking home when the sun is high, and coming alongside us on the street in our city is the drone of a truck. The city is a streaming procession of early greens, with light behind the hills rising and luring us into its smoke. You are talking about the white flowers that are blossoming. Watching you in your blue dress, I think, she has the look of a woman dizzy with the love of wide petals and rivers, and she is ready to sit down and rest on the banks, where a few children are tossing a ball, and the water is sparkling with their shouts. There are splashes from birds, splashes from fish, and a revving of boats. If you ask me what is the shape of the world, I would say it's a spiral, winding and widening and forming a cone, a wisp of smoke, a wreath, and then a spinning on the long axis through the remembering and the forgetting, a continuous coil, and as with protrusions and hollows, a deterioration, or it's a balustrade, a seashell, a galaxy curling, or tornado funnel, a tropical storm cloud, a fractal, a strand of genetic instruction. But I have not yet established my orientation, nor am I ready to follow the smoke. The shape of the world is the shape of 1,000 promises, urgent alliances, despair that leads to terror, the time of day or night when one knows where north and south are like a garland of rangeland fences. As a boy, south was the Gulf, north the Red River. That was my position. Sometimes later I became an I, and sometimes a he, and sometimes later you became a you, and you became a she. In trying to bring back a morning, as if from the surface of a cave shaped like an alabaster skull, to bring back moments in this meager survivor's journal of mine, before the first appearance of light in the sky before sunrise, it's as if morning doesn't want to begin again. I find myself groping for what feels like scratches on the hollow of a thigh, like seeing ashen clouds zipper across the sky. It's not true that I forget things. The memories are there. And they exist before anything else at the beginning of the story. The imprecision of it is what is most precise. It's like slipping over gravel and toppling face down on the ground, or being dragged over stones and feeling that all I'll remember is the falling, the sharpness. Here in the west now, I am oriented by the river to the west and the mountains to the east. And also to the east, the puzzle pieces of America, with its mechanics and vistas and adamant songs, with its rogues and easy dollars. And beyond the Atlantic, there's the disappearance and exactitudes of Europe. And Arabia, too, where the deserts of the prophets are sometimes sandstone and other times sand. The deserts, not barren lands, but behind each hill and valley is a man who does not look for God within him, so sure that he is within God. It's a place for visions. Even the ground seems only focused on the sky, with the wild geese in flight, honking like herds of goats shepherded by Bedouins, who now stop to look at clumps of boxthorn that twist in the sand like coronets of barbed wire. From here, I get the news of the world. I map and intersect the grid lines of what I have yet to forget. Everything remains where it is all at once, and I remember almost nothing, and everything that appears disappears, like a shadow of rain clouds in the sky's mouth. In a city neither was born in, we are nameless. After making love, we are ash. Studded into the folds and embrace of an elbow, my sweat is like dust. In the folds of your elbows down to your narrow wrists, your skin glitters like first stars. Sweat and dust, and glitter and stars. I write these down as memorandums of distance and of measure, and of the good weather hushed under the word, inside the word, like after Pompeii, when there were gradations of dark and a bewilderment of light, and when the next mornings began, time was unguarded. We sit in the room. In the split of a human heart, you say, a heart will split like an apple. A woman will place her heart into the palm of a man, I say, a man into the palm of a woman. And the imprint of a white shadow of a leaf on the dark ground is God protecting all of us. And so we are nameless as ash. And now, as in basins of glitter, ash blows up our skin with a terrible warmth. We are entangled. Our bodies are smooth and brown and pink and gray and almost clean, like clouds blowing into the morning skies. Here in this room, your shoulders are bare and your arms tan. Your fingers are not always yours. You have been easy with flowers too long, and familiar with pleasure, same as agony, too long. Nothing, same as everything. They have been your habits, but not the embrace of rain, as if embracing a body could be like holding a single drop of falling rain, but not joy. Holding you in this embrace with our bare skin clean and the ash now somewhere in the back of a cloud in my mind, I think that holding your body is like coming in from a village under papery skies and gathering there along the road a basket full of blackberries and later currants. Later the fruit withers or gets plowed in. A small fire will keep the room shuttered, and the day will also rise. And the people will begin their morning solemn as a moon over the sea. Although you have seen impatience, but not your children, although once you say you were clear of despair, from the beginning you expect the love to go badly. From the beginning you laugh at the fables of hell in our skin. But love did not give you permission to be diverted, and now you have lived enough in mechanical rooms. You have lived with the faith that the erotic can heal. You say, it wasn't impatience that aroused us. It was our fingers pressed into the bright flesh between our shoulders. A burned man sleeps with death for the rest of his life, in one photograph. While in another photograph, some ungrown hair dots a head like pins in a map. There's a brother and a missing sister. A hospital ship is a hotel for firemen. A burned, bald spot is a map of Crimea. The rest of the small head is the Black Sea. Through Times Square, a police escort of semis with digging equipment of flatbeds arrives from the iron mines of Minnesota. The avenues are deserted, just as when Hannibal arrives in triumph in Rome. The roses are grinding it out. The weeds are undefeated. Love, like a blue marble, hardens and glistens. Across the little Tiber River bridges, the elephants growl with bugles and limp in triumph. Though sorrow was everywhere, in their hideaway near the other river, in the other city, in my memory, he witnessed nothing. Yes, slaughter was someplace, but also her clean hands were on his bare skin, her breasts pressed to his clean chest. between suffering is what God wants. And always a village is sick, and always there is laughter. We must admit she will be able to hear even the sound an oar makes through water. Even now, outside the German camps, decades after the exterminations there is dust on the roads, and the grass is dull, gray, but not green. The barbed wire, like the desert clumps of boxthorn, is not particularly sinister. There is the same clumps outside Fort Lewis, Fort Hood, Fort Leonard Wood. There are 173 Army installations in the United States, and 152 overseas, not including 16 overseas naval installations and 17 overseas Air Force installations. Whatever the name of the town in Germany, it is still a town of barracks. The green siding's pleasant, the insides efficiently cool with concrete. The benches provide a place to put down clothes. There are the windowless bathhouses and a spy hole in the door, and naked men and naked women and the children naked. Then hot air with pale blue crystals of gas. What need to scrawl on the floor with the chalk the word vergassed? Night after night, after day after night on television, there is the watching of the watching, the reconstructing of the reconstructing of the events. Again and again into the side of one tower an airplane strikes the glass higher than in the other tower. But that is nothing like memory, with its sudden alterations and alternations of snow and sleet, and the roads glazed and churning and darkening. In the reconstruction on television, it is always the same. Skies, the jets, the crash, the rubble, exactly the same until the screen cuts or darkens and the broadcaster resumes, then takes a break, and a commercial pops up for hair removal product, and the barges of time cross with cheerful blue eyes. The reconstruction on television makes apocalyptic freaks look like symmetrical adversaries. The reconstruction on television confuses the real with the symbolic. It makes murder look like a spectacle of the sublime. In memory, there is something to do with a bright sky and the aroma of autumn leaves, and there are faint sounds of straw in the wind, and the heavy mist is hardly visible. And there are the junior highs in Ohio, in Florida, in North Dakota, from the east back across the west, where the after-school dances are postponed, then rescheduled with trembling music, and a boy waiting outside the lockers near the art room for the one he does not know. Tonight she is being dropped off by her father. The boy waits for a chill, like a spiraling cloud to funnel up his spine, or is it the other way around? Like rain to spill down, so that the two of them suddenly skip into the gym, onto the hickory flooring, among the altars of bodies and the undressing of the light. And they begin to dance slowly. He has his hand buckled behind her hips, and her hands rest upon his chest. They are trying to look at each other and to look away at the same time, and not be seen doing either, as if simultaneously to forget and to remember. And in a slow circle, like evaporation, they step and they step. It's as if they're being led to an open window, and they step. All in all, Rome collapsed under its own weight. Eventually you were going to run out of booty and slaves. Eventually you were going to run out of territory to conquer. After the vultures flew over the Parthenon, flocks of small birds began to fragment, some to the east, others to the south, some to the eaves of cathedrals. Living on the borders were the barbarians. German by heritage, educated by Rome, the barbarians built a navy in Carthage and, 455 AD, sacked the city, looted and pillaged, and then also, like a small boat, moved on. The Roman mob killed the emperor. The system of generals and senators splintered into the tongues of warlords, and the history of Europe was set in place for the next 2 millennia. Peak followed by collapse. When King Louis VII and Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine left their French lands with little military knowledge for the Second Crusade in 1145 AD, leading 30,000 men for 5 months across Asia Minor through Turkish lands, and in constant fear of attack by local Muslims, they diverted north to Odessa, then south to Damascus, then to defeat at the army of Nur al-Din. But in the First Crusade, in 1099 AD, 13,000 crusaders after 3 years and 3,000 miles marching arrived in June at the gates of the city where Jesus of Nazareth was born, where Jesus of Nazareth died. They had to break in. The walls were 50 feet high and 10 feet thick. They meant to scale them with ladders and siege towers, but the Muslim defenders had raised the area of its trees. So the Christians would find, miraculously, hidden underground, enough timber to build 2 siege towers. On July 14, 690 years before the citizens of Paris would storm the Bastille, they attacked. The Christians captured a Muslim defender, strapped him to a catapult, and flung him like a missile back over the walls. And the Muslims counterattacked with pots of oil and flaming bolts. After the Crusaders finally breached the walls, they slaughtered 30,000 Muslims, Jews, and fellow Christians. Thus rose Saladin, and the dust and sand and the barren hills of jihad. Mark the tour buses with your love. And remember the pressed blouse and white gloves of the tour guide with the microphone, her bright smile and ice cream cap. She is like the lover you once thought of having. So on the day you leave her, you always remember her blouse and skirt and the way the sound of her laughter was like weeping. Now mark the fenced-off ruins, for the world is full of blown-out windows with skylights like spiders' webs and vacant ceilings and men torn from sleep. And now mark the necessity of not remembering any of that. If there is no one to mend the roads, there are always office workers en route to lunch, and the tour buses directing your attention to the hospitals and battlefields, where the earth swallowed the good and the bad, and those who rebelled against forgetting, as if against death, died there with their mouths open. You must mark the praise and mark the curses. You must mark the learning and getting confused. In our room, in the American West, we are amateurs at pleasure. You are pulling the weight of my body like an incantation closer. The silence in our room that night was punctuated by 2 crows outside squealing. You spoke in a whisper that seemed to come out of some exile in a small town in the valley, while outside the crows quieted and distanced themselves from the others. There was a pleasure in their silence that took the shape of darkness. There was dying somewhere, despair somewhere, longing somewhere solitude. But here at last I retrieved from the room the ghost of the very crow we were seeking. It stood before me, like the beautiful illumination that fought with Jacob, not as a man now, but as a woman who approaches as I sit in a red chair, who seems to have descended spiral stairs from an orange sky to hover near my eyes like an angelic blue star. When I grab one claw with my right hand, she seizes my left arm And even as I embrace the black gown of the crow and try to tackle her, she kicks at my head. While both of us strive, neither prevails. And all the while the city of worshippers prays around us, with their white coifs pulled down above their eyes. I want to sing a lament for her who held me as if in exile, until the breaking of the day, and sing for her who was neither victorious nor defeated, so as not to bring death or love between us, as the trees whitened in the night. Face to face now, she called back at me with the tally of the violations of the laws and customs of war. These include murder, killing of hostages, plunder, destruction of cities, towns, villages, devastations. And I saw her body in this new morning. It was a woman's body, tan, and also white, where her clothing had covered her. But then someone was calling her away, as if calling a small girl in from the yard, as if calling a woman who has told her story of impossible love and tasted her lover's name. That's when, in the room, the boundaries of silence were like the boundaries of a small ship, or like the boundaries a small ship crosses with the imperishable ringing of a buoy bell in the distance. I remember now, in Elaine René's Hiroshima Mon Amour, the Japanese is a man who is happy with his wife. The French woman is a woman who is happy with her husband. They are in his city. They are in his room in the city of Hiroshima. His wife is out of town. They have met the night before. It would have been too easy, the Japanese says, when he learns later that the French woman is leaving for Paris by plane in the morning. The whole thing is ridiculous, the French woman says. It is not yet evening. A white sky, and the phone keeps ringing. They embrace, followed by kissing. She's looking at nothing over his shoulder except at her own thoughts of herself in this moment. It is for the sake of looking only. In her eyes is the understanding that Paris is liberated, and Hiroshima is again a living city. And even the bars, where they met the night before, but you don't know this yet, are open late with jukeboxes and glasses of Sapporo. And they have both survived, and their pain, with their joy, is who they have become. They are almost pressed against a bookshelf now, but no longer embracing exactly. Her wedding ring on her right hand is like a slender silence against the ringing of the telephone. She is unbuttoning her white blouse in front of him. Her eyes are brightening and have the look of looking as her fisted hand, one by one, fingers the buttons and the top of her blouse opens. She asks, "What difference can it make?" She doesn't mean to be offhand. She's asking, what difference can it make? Tomorrow I must write, what is the span of one's life against the dark green of the nights? I'll read one more. At last, the morning is here. There's the smell of coffee and baked bread and the urge to depart to the far-off rocky places where the crows retreat from the brightening blue sky. When I ask you to stay, you have already decided to. Done, you say. I'm done. To be miserable is to stand in a place loved once without expectation, like rain falling out to the very edge of going away. I imagine you now rising into the air as if you are a woman dissolving inside the high boughs of an apple tree under a yellow sky. You watch me as I whisper for a red ram with orange horns to come closer. But if one were watching the two of us from a distance, you suddenly clean in your skin and up in the tree, the sky yellow with the sun like a bubble above the green roofs, they would see that the way I hold my arm out to the ram might look as if I'm not calling him closer, but releasing him into the day. Now you are waving your hand as if to wipe the mist from the air. Your voice is blurry as a serenade. I imagine we have come to meet and to remember. Yet all along we are tailor-made for forgetting. And I imagine I am walking off into a dark alley now, back to the boulevard with a black dog trotting ahead, so that even though terrible wrongs are being committed by myself and others, the world is still elegantly ready to do good. It's still a place where we might sit on a bench in a garden of white roses and watch the early summer and discover joy like a love discovered too late, like a disease cured, even if too late, as lights in the city and the lights elsewhere neon on and off, like the toys of God. I'll stop with that and take some questions. If you have a question.
Well, I'll ask you, David.
Thanks, Tom.
In how you approach writing this, because in every writer has 1,000 faces. You're talking about procrastination as one of the elements. And so just with what you're talking about here, how did you approach writing what you did?
Yeah, I don't. Do I say procrastination is an element of writing? Trying to put off writing as long as possible, yeah. But doing something while you're putting it off. Well, it took me a long time to prepare to write the book. One, emotionally, just to prepare. There were times when there were passages, I didn't read some of them, where, really writing about some visceral, as detailed as I could get, violence. And I would just have to stop. I just couldn't bear it. But taking notes, writing notes, practicing some of the images, getting a sense of the component parts, learning stuff. I didn't know all that stuff about the Crusades, for instance, so reading a lot, taking more notes than I ever needed. Do research, I guess. There's parts in here about the Holocaust, natural disasters. Pompeii, I mentioned, it comes back, the tsunami recently. Native American history. It's a lot of learning. So, whatever I would call learning on my part. And then, thinking about how I felt about it. Thinking about how you feel about it is the procrastination part. Because you think you feel something, and then you start to think about it, and you begin to realize your feelings are more complicated than the initial feeling. You have a capacity to continue to evolve. And then that renders your old feelings not mute, but evolved from. Which makes you not want to write. Why bother writing when you can just think about it?
I was wondering, David, in the long narrative, Bill Sarrett has that wonderful phrase, follow the golden thread. So when you're writing a long narrative like that, 100 pages, 44 sections, how do you maintain that plumb line where you don't have all these disparate images, short themes, short sections that are like dangling parts?
Mm-hmm.
How do you keep them all linked in so that there is a symmetry that carries all the way through the narrative?
Yeah, that's a great question. I have no idea. If I did, I'd turn it into a pill. I'd sell it. I don't know, really. I think my method is not to worry about it, not know the answer. When you look at finished work, look at Dante's Inferno. Well, we've been reading that for centuries. Well, in various languages. So many people with their own literary dramas, national dramas, have been encountering that poem. And boy, we see all kinds of connections over time. And but in the writing of it, I can't speak for Dante, but in the writing of it, you're not sure. Who was it who said this? Maybe it was Il Doctorow who said, speaking of writing a novel, I think this is maybe, I used this, I think it was Doctorow who said this, and I kept this kind of magneted to the refrigerator in the back of my mind, right? Writing a novel is like driving a long distance in the dark with the headlights on. You can only see as far as the headlights, but you can make the whole trip that way. Isn't that good? Makes writing a novel seem like really easy. But it's not. I don't know. I wouldn't try. But that's kind of, just figuring you'll pick it up. What I would say too about it is if the little obsessions come back around, and then you pick it up and kind of go with there, and then the ordering. I haven't really rearranged the order. It's been pretty much in the sense of it. There's a little bit of an ekphrastic quality to this piece too, which is that film I mentioned. I wanted to bring that up, Hiroshima Mon Amour. I don't know if you know that movie. Some of you may know that movie. It's gotten a little attention lately. I guess Elaine Renee just died last couple years ago, and Marguerite Duras wrote the screenplay for this. And it opens with a scene, and what you see is you're not quite sure what you're looking at. It looks like sand, maybe it looks like a hill of sand, or maybe it's dust, then maybe it's sweat. You're not sure. And then it kind of comes back a little bit, and you realize it's a couple entangled, in bed. And given the themes of the movie, post-Hiroshima, you can see how everything is covered by history, by the dust of it all. And I was very influenced by that idea and thinking about this problem. Another question?
I was going to ask, sort of following up what he was saying, do you think there's, in terms of keeping certain themes going throughout a long piece, long work, do you think there's subconscious working there in terms of your creative process as well as conscious? Does that make sense?
Yeah. I'm sure it is. I mean, it's happening right now. Yeah, I think so. And I think that's the part of the mulling it over and sketching and coming back and whatnot, is you interrupt yourself with your discoveries. Being able to go into that unconscious. I mean, I was thinking of that poem I was speaking about at the beginning, A Blessing. It really is a good example of an illustration of what you're talking about. When he I read the poem once, so let's go with this. When he crosses over the barbed wire and goes from the road into the field, that's as much as going from conscious to unconscious, is right. That's dust going from light to dark. That's a passageway, and then his experience there is he essentially finds himself as when he unites with the ponies. He doesn't lose his humanity. He gains an inclusiveness with the rest of the world. He don't say this in the poem, but then he of course has to climb over the fence and get back on the road. The opening poem of this whole manuscript is this poem you have called Room, and I thought I'd finish with that. I want to say thanks for letting me read that to you. I hope that didn't give you a headache. And let's wish you all luck. And let's make sure we stand up for the things that matter. Room. After it came in like a dark bird out of the snow, barely whistling the notes, father, mother, child, it was hard to say what made us happiest. Sing the branches where it had learned to stir the air that opened without fear. Just the branches and us in a room of wild things. Like a shapeless flame, it flew a dozen times around the room, and in a wink, a dozen more, into the wall, the window, the door. You said the world turns to parts. You said the parts are cunning spheres. You said you always love the face of sin. You said it's here, the lips and eyes and skin. Outside the snow deepened with heaves of discontent. Inside the tremor of our life flew in and in and in. Thank you so much. I appreciate you coming. Thanks, Tom. Appreciate it.